Before we get started, just as a heads up, some trigger warnings. There's mentions of death, but there is also quite a bit of vulgar language that you might not be used to in my videos, so just proceed with caution. Thank you for joining me. In the Vigilante Diaries, you won't always be able to make the decision you want. In different moments, your decisions will be conditioned both by your previous choices in the game and by the level of your statistics. All of them may have a negative or positive value, but negative will not always mean detrimental, just as positive will not always mean beneficial. Therefore, an aggressiveness of +5 can be very helpful in combat, but it will mean a huge problem if you have to keep calm in a tense situation. It's up to you. Oh, it moved it on it. December 2nd, 1980. A night like any other.
Last night was definitely a rough one. Yeah, I should write about it.
December 2nd, 1980. Any given night. I'm freezing my ass in here. I must have been out in the streets for 3 hours now, at the corner of 6th and Rollins, 2 blocks from where I grew up. I'm looking at the Irish pub window through my binoculars. Keen's. I used to come here when I was a kid. The owner had a peculiar Irish name. Kieran. It's pronounced Kieran. Kieran Keane. As a kid, I always found his full name hilarious. The 3 people I've been keeping an eye on for weeks are here today. Dominic Tanner O'Toole, Carson Bennett, and Alyssa Marcan? 3 cops, all dirty. Lieutenant Chesney tipped me off about them. They run some kind of under-the-radar unit, call themselves Stronghold. They began small, sticking up small-time dealers, but somehow it snowballed into gun trafficking, blackmailing protected witnesses, and extortion. The Stronghold offers protection, they say. They believe they own this city. They have no remorse, and they hide behind their badges. Sickens me. That's why I've been patiently waiting outside while I watch them getting hammered at Keen's. It's their weekly ritual. I suspect it's where they split the money they make with Stronghold. Drunk cops in an Irish pub. Fuck me. These guys are a living cliché, for God's sake. I could have gone after them one by one, but I need to send the message to all 3 of them at once. This Stronghold bullshit ends today, and they better acknowledge it. As I wait for the 3 cops to leave the pub, I do what I always do when I'm about to make a move. I mentally repeat the code to myself. It's something I put down in this journal before even my first night out. Guidelines and principles. Some red lines. The first red line was about lethality. How far was I willing to go to impose justice? Could I justify killing, even in self-defense or defense of others? And how would that affect my life? I made a decision. Under no deaths, under no circumstance. If I have to choose between me and the criminals, it's clear who's going down. And the end justifies the mean. I'm going to say just the... I don't consider myself a cold-blooded killer, but that's the way things are. This rule applies only to bad guys, though. No innocence and no law enforcement. No way. Law enforcement doesn't include these Stronghold guys. They've been out of the protect and serve business for a long time. This is going to be like one of those personality tests. Yeah. Oh no. The second red line was about privacy. Would I keep living a normal life after this? Would I face the struggle on my own, or would I need help from someone else? And was my need for justice more important than my private life? I made a decision. No one must know. It's just me against everyone, period. I knew it before I began my mission. I have a family and friends. I can't risk anyone else getting dragged into this world of violence. If I get help, it has to be a one-time thing like Chesney. Other than that, I'm on my own. The third red line was about my ideology. Why was I doing what I was doing? And what was the ultimate goal of my actions? Was I trying to set an example or open the eyes of society? I made a decision. For equality. Crime always hits the working class hard. Its target is clear: the tired, the poor, and the huddled masses. The average citizen suffer while the powers that be let them rot in misery and corruption, safely watching from their ivory towers. I'm here to help the ordinary men and women to make their lives better. I come from below, and I keep that in mind every time I'm out in the streets. The 3 cops finish their last round, pay at the counter, and leave. O'Toole and Bennett smoke outside, sheltering from the snow beneath the pub's marquee. Marchin waits patiently. She's the only non-smoker. I assess the situation. 2 of them are drunk as a skunk, and that's good. But I'm sure the 3 of them are armed, and that's bad. I better act fast and take advantage of the element of surprise. In other circumstances, 3 cops would mean big trouble. But that's why I've waited for this moment. I needed the 3 of them to be plastered. Still, I doubt dealing with Stronghold can be solved without violence. I hope my brass knuckles and combat knife will be enough, but I always carry the unregistered .38 revolver just in case. I checked the cylinder to make sure it's loaded. I'm ready. O'Toole and Bennett toss their cigarette butts on the ground. The 3 of them walk to where they parked the car, near 7th. I know the area. The shortest route is the alley behind Keen's, the perfect place for me to intercept them. I don't show up with a smoke bomb or hanging off a roof or any of that bullshit. I'd probably break my neck if I did. I just cover my face and turn the corner to block their way. I'm not a lunatic or a madman. Those people make me sick. I don't pretend to be America's public enemy #1, but most of all, I don't want to get caught and fried in the electric chair. That's why I don't want to be identified. That's why I cover my face with my own hood and a bandana. I made myself a custom mask. I needed something custom made, safety first and foremost, but also something distinctive. I'm no craftsman, but with time and perseverance, even the most inept can make something decent. All I needed was a field hockey mask reinforced with a metal frame covered with fiberglass and resin. I couldn't help myself making it red. I know it looks a little striking, but it looks menacing. As soon as I made the breathing vent, I knew I made the right choice. This was going to be my face. Carson, Bennett is a tall one and is the first to notice me. He frowns. He's not sure he sees what he's looking at. Hey, O'Toole, look, isn't that the masked guy asshole? He says, and he chuckles. He's really smashed. Dom O'Toole. O'Toole looks me up and down and nods and says my name. That name is the one I choose. I guess we'll stick with our theme. When I began this, I knew I had to become a symbol. Every time they heard my name, I wanted them to know there was someone out there cleaning up the streets. I wanted them to know the fear that honest citizens know. I'm here to do justice. I'm Knight's Justice. Purely happenstance that I chose justice. It just seemed to fit. Carson Bennett. Hey, you! Bennett laughs. What the fuck do you want? Marchin is silent. She's the least drunk of the 3. O'Toole is the leader. Bennett is the muscle. But she is the brains, no doubt. I step forward. Stronghold is over today. O'Toole is the first to talk. Who the hell do you think you're talking to? You think we're afraid of some weirdo in a costume? He says as he advances towards me. He still doesn't take me seriously, but hearing Stronghold has definitely upset him. Bennett, the tall one, is still behind him. He smiles with a stupid look on his face. He's fucking drunk. And she looks at me. She's the one who worries me the most. Then O'Toole pulls out a knife. I see the gleam of the blade out of the corner of my eye. Looks brand new. Oh, right. Now I get the Tanner nickname. You're not even worth wasting a fucking bullet on, you dumbass. I didn't expect this, but a knife is always better than a gun. They definitely don't take me seriously. That's good. I won't solve this by talking, that's for sure. The situation is complicated. These three aren't going to take turns fighting me like this was a kung fu movie. I won't be able to take on three at once. I have to select my first target carefully. I dodge O'Toole and walk past the drunk, Bennett. I'm worried about her. She's worried. She's definitely the most dangerous one. I get to her in time to throw a punch to her face. Unfortunately, she's fast as hell. She dodges to the side, but I manage to hit her shoulder. A Beretta 92 falls in a pile of snow on the ground. She was going to shoot me. Thankfully, Bennett's fat ass blocked most of the alley, but of course she's no idiot. She won't shoot me with her service weapon. Too much paperwork. That's why she carries the Beretta. Clever girl. Before she can reach for her gun, I kick the ankle of her supporting foot with the sole of my boot, with all my strength. I hear a crack and she falls to the ground, soaked from the shit and sleet in the alley, yelling in pain. One down, that gives the other two time to react. I have to do something. As O'Toole approaches me, knife in hand, Bennett grabs me from behind. He's massive and he reeks of whiskey, but not cheap whiskey. Guy is fucking loaded. You're going to regret what you did to Alyssa, you fucker. O'Toole shouts like a madman and walks towards me faster. If I don't do something quick, I know what's coming next. Best case, the vet sews me up with 12 stitches. Worst case, I end up in a grave. I have to anticipate. Disarm O'Toole. And of course I fail. Who the hell do I think I am? Bruce Lee? As I put my leg down, that fucker O'Toole stabs my ribs with the knife. It's a good thing that with all that adrenaline, it doesn't hurt too much. The bad thing is he stuck it deep. I fucking knew it. Bad call. I miscalculated. I have to get out of here. With the strength I have left, I kick O'Toole with both feet and I push back and fall into Bennett, who finally releases me from his grip. I only have a few seconds to look at the pool of blood I left behind. Gotta get away. Fuck it. I start running in the opposite direction at full speed. I don't even look back to see if I'm being chased or not. I just run like a bat out of hell, down 10th and Pierce, hoping not to hear the sound of a gun going off behind me. That memory on the plains 40 miles from Saigon pops into my head. I run a few blocks and turn a couple corners. I change my clothes and remove my mask. To say that didn't go the way I hoped is an understatement. I doubt Stronghold feels threatened by what happened tonight. I wasted weeks of surveillance. Lieutenant Chesney will not be amused. What a fuck-up. I have to be more careful, damn it. This can't happen again. Can I back up and choose differently? Nope. This has gone terribly wrong. I miscalculated. I'm such an idiot. As soon as I get a few blocks away, I touch my ribs. I'm bleeding like a stuck pig. Shit. I hope it's not serious. Yeah, I need to get to the vet for stitches.
Masked vigilante terrorizes city streets. 3 police officers attacked. The Observer headline. Morning edition. Next to a composite sketch. Well, whoever drew it managed to get a pretty accurate description of my outfit. I've been sloppy. I gotta be more careful. Yeah, the terrorizes thing wasn't exactly what I was expecting. But I wasn't expecting high praises for what I do either. I should use that to my advantage, in any case. Terrorizes. So, I guess, this city is afraid of me.
Chapter 1, 1958, Origins. May 3rd, 1952. There was a sociological profile in the article. Some things were just pure bullshit, but I have to say some of the other things were spot on. Working class citizen, an extremely reserved person, probably a war veteran, either Korea or Vietnam. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much me, but I'm not just that. I was born in 1952, years after World War II. I grew up on the stories of American soldiers liberating Europe from the Nazis, the Uncle Sam posters, the Times Square kissing picture, fighting for truth, justice, and the American way, and all that. I guess all those glorified war stories have something to do with what I do now. Of course, then came Korea, and after that, Vietnam. Spending 13 months in Hue and Saigon probably also have something to do with what I do now in these streets. Anyway, I was born in a working-class family. I wouldn't say we were poor as church mice, but we weren't exactly well-heeled either. I grew up in a hole in a wall on the 3rd floor of the 19 Monroe Avenue at the intersection of Benson and 10th. But it could have been anywhere. All working-class neighborhoods were similar back then. Men coming home with sore backs after an endless day of work, women keeping order in tiny 600 square feet apartments full of children, where there was never any silence. Children wearing hand-me-downs from their older siblings. Tobacco smoke filling the living rooms, black and white television set in some houses, a radio in all of them, electric radiators in winter, children cooling off with fire hydrants in summer, peanut butter sandwiches in McKinley Park. What was considered a happy childhood in the 1950s. My dad worked at the docks, another working-class hero. As far as I can tell, and despite having hardly any education, he was a well-read guy. Beyond the Western dime novels, I mean. He even read Steinbeck when he was in France during the war. The cross necklace. And the high-waisted pants. Grandpa? I guess the Grapes of Wrath had a lot to do with him being president of the city's stevedores union chapter. If you have a problem with your boss, talk to Frank Donovan, they used to say. Mom didn't look anything like a poster housewife of the 1950s, first of all, because she wasn't a housewife, no matter how much my father insisted she quit her job. Esther Donovan was not a kept woman, she always replied. So she served tables at Agnello's Steakhouse, a restaurant just north past the interstate toward Greenville. All the neighbors said Esther wore the pants in the Donovan house, and they were right. Mom was quite the character. I'm not saying she wasn't sweet and loving, but overall, she was as tough as nails and as wise as King Solomon. And then there was my older brother, Paul. He was 1 year older than me, but we almost looked like twins, like 2 peas in a pod. A brother at that age means everything, a friend, a confidant, a playmate, and sometimes a rival, someone to fight with over who gets the last piece of Mom's cherry pie or some other thing. We collected trading cards together, played ball together, watched The Lone Ranger together, read Dad's comics together. We were always together. And then there was me. Mnealia Donovan. Sorry I gave you a girl's name. So sorry, buddy. Anyway, it looks good on you. I worry about writing my full name here in case someone finds and reads this journal. It's an absurd worry. If someone finds this journal, it's because they caught me. And there are much more worse things here in my hideout. So I believe that I'm the protagonist of this story, an average Joe, no remarkable traits, except one. I'm gonna go with my dad's principles. Like father, like son, Dad had strong convictions, and he passed on to me what mattered most in life were his principles, and to go to the end to defend them if necessary. He knew his enemies. He thought on what he had done wrong and learned how to improve. And although he sometimes lost his temper, he always had in mind why he did what he did, just like me on the streets. My father worked at the port. He was the okay. Donovan boys. One of my earliest memories is visiting my father at the port. I still remember the smell, a mix of sea, salt, fuel, sweat, and smoke. A busy place, almost all day long. And noisy as fuck, too. If it wasn't stevedores and sailors screaming at each other, it was the sound of mechanical cranes or the squawking of seagulls. At that time, I didn't understand exactly what my father did for a living. I was too young to know what a union president was. All I knew was that he worked at the port, but he didn't load cargo, run a ship, or operate cranes. I just knew that he spent all day in a small office on the docks, which he called the shithouse. That was Frank Donovan at his best. Subtlety was never his strong suit. The shithouse became another playground for my brother and me. We spent hours in that place, as if it was our own house. For my father, it was the headquarters from where he fought for the rights of dock workers, alongside his union buddies. Donovan's boys, they called them. But there were some things my father couldn't take care of from inside the shithouse, especially when there was problems with the shipping companies. At that time, the shipping companies had established what was known as open shop. In other words, free hiring of workers. Being non-union for a longshoreman meant there was no wage regulation, no control over overtime, and no paid leave. And that's why Dad had been on the picket line with his boys for several days to paralyze the city port. Without dock workers, the port was as useless as a fishnet condom. The city was losing money hand over fist. Even so, the negotiations had gone awry several times already. The shipping companies were desperate, but Dad was used to dealing with tougher, meaner, and more dangerous people. And even those guys always said that Frank Donovan was a stubborn Irish bastard. Yeah, they were right. However, my mother wasn't pleased with the situation either. She took my brother and me to the port to see him one Friday afternoon. I must have been 4 or 5 at the time. The situation we found there was not what we expected. Things were heating up. On one side of the picket line were Donovan's boys. On the other side, the cops. I saw my dad, yelling like a maniac. He flipped the bird to the cops at least twice. My father saw us arriving and immediately ran over to us. He was sweating and looked agitated. "Esther, why did you bring the kids here? Damn it, they're..." Dad lowered his voice, and I heard what he said, but didn't understand a word anyway. "Those fuckers are threatening to call the National Guard if we don't disband immediately." "Then disband," my mother replied. "These kids haven't seen their father in 8 days, Frank. You have a family outside of the port, too." I know, and that's why I'm doing this. Please, take the kids home. We'll talk later. Please." I interrupted them. I tried to act brave. Yeah, that would be something this kid would do. "I'm not leaving. I'm staying with you, Dad." My father laughed and mussed my hair. He found it hilarious that a whippersnapper no taller than 3 feet from the ground was already as stubborn as he was. "You're cut from the same cloth as your father. You know that?" Mom sighed. Just a few seconds later, Paul pointed at the picket line. "Mom, Dad, look!" And then the police charged. The screams of the longshoremen drowned out everything else. There was no time for anything else. My father threw a bunch of keys at my mother. "To the shithouse! Get in there with the kids and lock the door," he shouted as he ran towards the now breached picket line. "And don't come out, you hear me?" We lost sight of Dad in the turmoil. We just heard him screaming, "You motherfuckers! Leave us alone!" And as young as my brother and I were, we couldn't take our eyes off the scene. The police handed out thwacks left and right, and without mercy. Blows to the legs, to the arms, to the head, or directly to the face. It was brutal. The Donovan boys ran with their faces covered in blood. A group of them fought back. They set fire to some machinery pieces, and a huge column of black smoke emerged in the middle of the dock. The whole city was going to know what had happened on that pier, and not just from the newspapers. When things calmed down, almost an hour after the incident, we left that shithouse. We walked along the port, and it had been razed from top to bottom. A police officer looked at us on our way out. He seemed so surprised to see a woman with 2 children that he didn't even question us. He just let us go. My father returned home at midnight. A Lincoln Continental brought him. The driver was a guy with a tiny mustache. The one in the front passenger seat, a guy with curly black hair and olive skin, took him to the door and shook his hand. I noticed Dad was visibly uncomfortable. He went inside and my brother and I hugged him as soon as he walked through the door. My mother did not. She just looked at him from the kitchen with a stern face and asked him who that was. Just a friend. And with that, my father settled it. We never spoke about the dock incident again. My mother didn't... Oh, wait. Oh, no. Losing relationship with Mom. Trading cards. My brother was a baseball nut. He never took off his Red Sox cap that Uncle Doug had brought back from Boston. He even had a bat signed by Sandy Koufax. Koufax? Oh, Koufax. I don't know. I'm so sorry. I must admit that I didn't care much about baseball, except for the trading cards. I loved them. Our collection was amazing. We had all the stars of the era, Al Kaline, Whitey Ford, Ray Boone, Mickey Mantle. Some Sunday afternoons, I would go to McKinley Park after church to trade leftover cards with other kids. A melting pot of Irish, Greek, Puerto Rican, and Italian-American kids gathered and traded cards, shouting like crazy, as if they were street vendors. Usually we all respected the rules of the game. From time to time you could find a clueless kid who didn't know his Roy Campanella card was worth, but that was considered fair game. But there were others who didn't respect the rules. Like Tiny Theo. His name was Theodorus Macropoulos, but someone had given him the nickname because the kid was fucking huge. Almost twice as big as the rest of the kids, both tall and wide. Tiny Theo was a shady character. We knew that because Paul had some bad experiences with him. Every time someone did business with Tiny Theo, they learned a valuable lesson. Paul hated his guts, and that's why we never traded cards with him. Tiny Theo was just a nuisance that most of us traders avoided, but not all the kids who came to McKinley Park on Sundays knew him. This time, it was Louis Aguirre's turn. He was one of the youngest kids there, not even 6 years old. But Tiny Theo didn't care about that. We saw Tiny Theo take a large deck from Louis's hands in exchange for a single card. Unless that was a limited edition signed by Babe Ruth himself, that was foul play. Tiny Theo was walking away from Louis. That poor kid didn't even flinch. He still didn't quite get what just happened with his deck. And then without a word, Paul headed straight for Tiny Theo. I asked him what the hell he was doing. I'm going to get that kid's deck back, damn it. I told him to help. Why don't we just give some of our spare cards? Join my brother. Can't join the brother. Oh, but that's what I want to do. Why don't we just give some of our spare cards to that poor kid? And Paul, we won't be able to beat Tiny Theo in a fight. We both know it. I spoke slowly, waiting patiently, while Tiny Theo was walking away. Just look at that poor kid, man. He was just now realizing what had happened to him. We were seconds away from him bursting into tears. My brother thought about it for a second. While it's true that he wanted to teach Tiny Theo a lesson more than anything, he also just felt really sorry for that little boy. Yeah, you're right, he grunted, accepting the harsh truth. Let's give some cards to Louis. It's only spares, okay? We waited until we lost sight of Tiny Theo. We called him over, who came up to us with the blank stare of an abandoned puppy. Paul handed him a pack of spare cards we had, and his little face lit up. Oh, thank you so much! And then he laughed, smiling from ear to ear. Paul looked at me, and I knew for a fact that he was mad about not beating Tiny Theo. But he felt good about helping the poor kid. You're a good guy. Let's go home. Come on. My mother loved to play cards. Twice a month on Saturday nights when she was free at Agnello's, she would set up a game at home. That night, as we finished dinner, my mother spoke to me as we did the dishes. Hey, are you up for a game tonight? It was the first time my mother had offered to play cards with me. I thought it was an exciting challenge, something for grown-ups, so I said yes without hesitation. But I'm warning you, this is the big league, she said, as she finished placing the plates on the dish rack. Don't expect any special treatment just because you're the youngest, understood? I wouldn't have expected anything else from my mother. She never sugarcoated anything. For years, it'd just been her and my dad playing gin rummy, but Paul had recently joined the games, so they switched to classic rummy, no home rules. Mom explained the rules to me in just 5 minutes. You have to match sets of 3s or more cards, either 3 of a kind or straights of the same suit. Like this, she spread out a 4 and a 5 and a 6 of spades on the table. This is called a meld. The first player who melds all of his cards goes out and wins the round, and then the other players have to add up the points of the cards they have in their hand without a meld. Mom picked up all the cards and began shuffling them. Easy, isn't it? It seems simple, even for my young age. We gathered around the table, and I had Paul on my left and my mother on my right. She began to deal the cards with confidence and a smile on her face. My father picked them up with a certain laziness. I don't think Dad was that enthusiastic about rummy because he knew that playing with my mother meant losing. Paul and I, however, were very focused. There were a lot of variables to take into account, and we were inexperienced. We played a couple of hands, when one after another my mother went out. Sometimes she even got rid of all of her cards. "I'm going rummy," she said. That meant double points for the rest of us. She was giving us the beating of our lives. Mom knew the three of us like the back of her hand, and her game proved it. "You have to pay attention to the cards, boys. Are you paying attention?" "I don't think so," she said teasingly. Paul was fuming. My father rolled his eyes, fed up with so much defeat. "Esther, darling, you're such a sore winner," he said, as I picked up the next card. "Well, I'm sorry," my mother smirked as she put down the last trio of cards she had left in her hand, "because I think Esther Donovan is going to win again." I focused on Mom's game. I noticed my mother's expression as I was dealing. I noticed how she would sometimes frown slightly when she received a card. It was almost imperceptible. Paul and my father hadn't noticed, but I had, and that frown had meant something. My hand wasn't so bad. I had a pair of deuces, 3 sevens, hearts, diamonds, and spades, already melded, a pair of jacks, and some high cards that didn't match. But I had decent hands before, and Mom always managed to lay out first, probably because I hadn't been paying attention to what she was playing. I had to meld my hand without laying off anything that might suit her. So I tried to keep looking at her face while she played. I was melding my cards. I tried to pull out one of those frowns from Mom with my layoffs. Every time she did it, it was like a small victory for me. The game went on until Paul announced what seemed like the greatest accomplishment of his short life. "I'm going out. Yes, finally." Considering where we were coming from, that wasn't so bad. My mother gave me a knowing look. She knew what I was trying to do, but she was a skilled player. Mom had almost everything melded, except for an ace and a deuce. Only 3 points. "Almost," she said. She stood up, filled with pride. "Better luck next time, son." She ruffled my hair and went to the kitchen to get something to drink. It took me a while to understand what that rummy game meant to my mother, why she was so happy. Games aside, it was the first time she saw her younger son adapt and fight back, even if it hadn't worked out in the end. I think my mother was proud to see me standing on my own 2 feet. Oh, nothing changed. Hey, we're back on neutral ground with Mama. Chrissy. I have memories of many firsts, but not the first time I saw Chrissy. For me, Christine Mahan was always there, like my parents or Paul. A childhood friend who lived 2 streets over, the daughter of one of my mother's best friends, an Officer Gordon Mahan. The Mahans were Irish and Catholic like us, and we went to the same church. Chrissy and I endured Father Matthew's sermons patiently, waiting for Mass to be over so we can get out and play. Mahan was a cop back in the time when it meant being loved and respected by the whole neighborhood. One Saturday before lunch, Chrissy came to my block. "Hey, you coming out to play?" She always called me from the street. Although she did like boys' stuff, like hide and seek and other things, playing with Chrissy didn't strictly mean playing. Sometimes we just talked, and at that time I was grateful to have someone to talk to. We went for a stroll around the block, a stop by Bob's store, and maybe pop over to Karen Keen's bar for a milkshake, back when Keen served milkshakes. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" she asked abruptly. I replied that I wanted to be anything but a longshoreman. Although some years had passed, the dock episode was still in my mind. "I'm going to be a police officer, like my dad," she said proudly. But I didn't picture her as a cop, and I told her. I'm going to go with this. You're too smart to be a cop." I said it as if it was an obvious statement. "What do you mean?" She looked at me intrigued. Chrissy was the most intelligent person I knew. Her grades were superb. I told her that she was worth much more. To be a judge, a scientist, cure a disease, or send rockets into space. She was destined to do something important. I even thought Chrissy had the potential to be the first female president of the United States. But any dork could be a cop. That's not true. My father's smart. She still didn't get what I wanted to tell her. I'd never been good with words, and the limited vocabulary of an 8-year-old didn't help me either. I tried to explain that it was true that Officer Mahan was no idiot, but he wasn't like Chrissy. People like Mahan, my dad, or me were streetwise. We read the circumstances. We dodged problems. Chrissy, however, was the kind of person who solved problems. She was analytical, thoughtful, sharp-tongued. Obviously, I didn't know any of those words at that age, but I think I managed to get through to her somehow. Well, Chrissy shrugged, I'm going to be a problem-solving police officer. Whatever that means. We returned home after the walk. We said goodbye at her building's doorway, which was a couple of blocks before mine. Before going in, she stared at me for a few moments, with a smile on her face. You're very strange, but I like you. And then she kissed my cheek. Playing chopstick. The weekends went by quickly until Sunday mornings. The biggest culprit was Father Matthew's sermons in church. Paul and I hated Mass, but we didn't dare to complain in front of Mom. She was devout. When I was little, Mass was daily. Now we barely comply with our obligations to the Lord. The way she put it, going to church sounded like some sort of heavenly tax to be paid. Definitely Catholic, huh? Yet my mother had a sweet and gentle view of religion. She spoke to us of a God who was infinitely good, who cared about us, who loved and protected us. Mom's God meant love. Father Matthew's God had nothing to do with that. My brother always said that Father Matthew reminded him of the evil giant in Jack and the Beanstalk. He was a huge fella, almost 6 feet tall. The echo of his throaty voice resonated in the church as he delivered his tightly focused sermons on angels with flaming swords, painful sacrifices, and divine punishment. His personal favorite was fire and brimstone falling on Sodom. Not even God couldn't find 10 righteous people in that city, he yelled. The guy was enamored with the Old Testament. Both Paul and me hated Mass, but for different reasons. Paul was just bored, but I was terrified of Father Matthew's God. Underneath his weekly sermons about the evil and righteousness and justice, there was an idea that probably defined his personality. Father Matthew believed we were all God's soldiers and life was a never-ending battle of good against evil. On Sunday, Paul told me he had learned a game for 2 in school. A game played with your fingers only. Chopsticks, it was called, and it was quite fun, perfect for Mass. We followed the routine along the rest of the churchgoers. We stood up, sat down, knelt, recited, and gave each other a sign of peace, but I was always looking at how many fingers were extended on Paul's hand. We were so focused on the game that neither one of us noticed Father Matthew's shooting glances. It was more than enough for him. Mass went by in the blink of an eye. My brother won 3-2. I admitted defeat, but I also pointed out that he had more practice than me. Our parents stopped to talk with a group of neighbors at the church gate, another Sunday morning ritual. And one of them, an old lady, pinched my cheek and said, "Look at you! How much you've grown! Do you know who I am?" I shrugged. Of course I didn't know who the old hag was. And as we waited for our parents to finish talking with the unnamed old lady in her group, we saw Father Matthew approaching us. "Hello, Frank. Esther, how's everything?" Father Matthew put his hand on my shoulder and Paul while speaking. "May I talk with the boys in private? It'll only be a second." A priest in the 1960s represented the highest authority for a Catholic family. Many parents left their children in the care of the priest without a moment's hesitation. There's no need to say how much trauma and suffering this blind trust caused. Fortunately for Paul and me, Father Matthew was not that kind of priest. But unfortunately for me, Father Matthew wasn't like Spencer Tracy's Father Flanagan in Boys Town either. He took us to the vestry next to the church. Paul and I followed him, terrified and silent, dealing with the unpleasant feeling in our guts, that mixture of shame for misbehaving and the fear of retaliation. Most of all, the fear of retaliation. As we entered, he led us to a small classroom. We knew the place from our CCD classes. Paul and I followed, and since he did not signal us to sit down, we just stood. Father Matthew closed the door after us and stood in front of the wooden teacher's table. "You know why you're here, boys." His deep, stern voice echoed in the silence of the vestry. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice, that I would let you play games in God's house? The church deserves all of your respect and all of your attention, even more than your own home, and Mass is one of them." Father Matthew stopped abruptly. Paul told me later that he hadn't said a word, made a gesture or anything at that moment. He just thought, "Oh, another boring sermon." But somehow Father Matthew knew what Paul was thinking. He pulled Paul's hair with his left hand violently. He almost dragged him across the floor. Am I boring you? You're the oldest, Paul. You have to set an example. Where's your judgment, boy? And he hollered like a madman. He raised his fist right above Paul's face. Took the blame. It was my fault, Father, he said. He held his hand on the spot and turned his head to me. He let go of my brother. I told him that if he had to punish someone, and it had to be me, I said that I had learned a new game at school and that it was a lot of fun and that I wanted to show it to Paul. That I wanted to impress my older brother, but it was not my intention to disrespect him. He put his hand on my shoulders. I squinted my eyes in anticipation of the slap, but it never came. You have shown courage, and you have shown sincerity, but most of all, you have shown fairness, and that's what matters most. You may go, boys, but don't ever think of fooling around in church again, okay? We nodded. A hair pulling was a more than favorable balance considering how it might have turned out. Why did you say that? Paul asked me. I shrugged. It was something I often did when I didn't know what to say. I just felt like doing it. It was stupid, he said as we walked back. But you saved my ass. I love you, little brother. Turning point. Up to this moment, I lived nothing but an ordinary childhood. Humble, definitely. A little rough in sometimes, maybe, but certainly mostly happy. In a few years, I would go to high school, meet a girl, have a job, get married, and have 2.5 kids in a house with a white picket fence and all that. Of course, that never happened. Or it didn't happen the way I expected it, at least. That my life went wrong had a lot to do with the most special person in my family. The one to whom I felt most attached, the most important person at that time in my life, my brother Paul. Paul was a real pain in the ass at times, stubborn as can be. He had the best and worst of Mom and Dad, and he got on both of their nerves quite often. But he was a funny, witty guy with a great sense of humor, and at the same time, a loyal friend with a heart as big as the world. He was always getting into trouble and often dragged me into it, but that was always a lot of fun. Even if we got our hide tan from time to time. Paul Donovan was much more than my brother. He was my soulmate. That's why his kidnapping tore me apart. Remember that day like it was yesterday. We lived about 10 minutes from school. We always walked back home. But that day, Mom couldn't pick us up from school. She had to work an extra afternoon shift at Agnello's. She told us to wait for Patrice, the lady who lived in the 4th floor of our building, to pick us up. Time passed, almost an hour, and then Paul stood up. I'm tired of waiting. Let's go home, man, he said, and started walking towards the intersection of 6th and Franklin. He stepped out of the door of the school gate, and a few raindrops began to fall. Paul put on his Red Sox cap. Okay, let's go. I followed Paul in the rain. I called out to him. He looked back at me. The rain began to fall heavily on our heads. Cats and dogs. Hurry up, you'll get soaking wet, you dork. Paul challenged me. Move it. And he broke into a run. Catch me if you can. We laughed as we ran under the rain, mostly Paul, who was getting further and further ahead of me. We were just a year apart, but a year means a lot when you're a kid. My legs were not fast or strong enough to catch up with Paul, so I decided to do something else. I took a shortcut. Paul ran down the street behind Demetrius' brother's workshop, a place near the canal where we sometimes went to play. I knew I could take a shortcut past the workshop and catch him in the vacant lot behind it. The mud would probably slow him down, and it was just a little further away. My brother was a smartass. He trusted in his legs too much. I ran at full speed, smiling as the raindrops soaked me, thinking of the look on Paul's face when he saw me appearing in front of him. I sped past Demetrius' shop at full speed, and I crossed into a vacant lot. When I arrived at the vacant lot, all I found was a Red Sox cap, and wheel tracks in the mud disappearing into the distance. Paul? I called, picking up his cap. Days passed. Officer Mahan, Chrissy's father, came to talk to us. I told him about the wheel tracks, that someone had to have taken my brother, that it had to be a force because he had never taken off his Red Sox cap before. Mahan had a lot to do with the police skipping the typical assumption. Sometimes kids run away from home. Thanks to him, Paul was considered an abduction from the start. Weeks passed. My brother's picture was plastered on milk cartons and taped to street lamps and telephone poles. We lived without living. From time to time we received a call. Some thought they seen Paul somewhere. Sometimes I was mistaken for him. Whether they called out of good intentions or opportunism, none of those calls came to anything. Months passed. People forgot about little Donovan. His face on the milk cartons and street lamps were replaced by another child. It angered me at the time, but what can you expect from a country where more than 500,000 people disappear every year? However, the neighborhood continued to talk about it. Even Sal, the honest export-import businessman, offered to help my family with the search. We had our differences, Frank, he said to my father, but if this happened to John or Andrea, I don't know what I'd do. Tell me how I can help, and I will. I was surprised that the mafioso liked Marchisio had red lines. Not many. I only had to read the news from time to time to see how Marchisio dealt with things, but he had a wife and 2 kids. Hurting children were out of the question for him. However, even with the police and the mafia throwing themselves to find my brother, not a trace of him could be found, and years passed. Hope is dangerous and fucked up. The disappearance of a loved one doesn't tear a family apart. It eradicates happiness, laughter, and joy. All of that disappeared from the Donovan household. And the hope for Paul's return filled up all the space. Everything was a sign. Maybe that police car parked nearby was going to tell us he's been found. Maybe that ringing doorbell is from a neighbor who has seen him. Maybe that kid with his back turned is him. Could it be him? But it never was. We only had 2 choices when it happened. Mom chose to hope, Dad chose to accept it, and that caused a lot of problems between them. And I chose to believe. Paul is alive and I'll find him. I told myself that until a police officer confirmed that they had found his body, Paul was alive, just like Mom. My brother is still alive. He's still alive. I repeated it to myself, over and over again. And every time the slightest hint of doubt creeps up on me, every time my own voice tries to convince me otherwise, every time I think to myself, 20 years kidnapped, really? I repeat the same thing to myself. My brother is still alive, and I will find him. Years later, I found the first clue to shed some light on what might have happened to my brother. When I came back from Vietnam, I had a hard time falling asleep. I had the television on in the background until the early hours in the morning, not even paying attention to it. But one night, I heard my old neighborhood mentioned. It was a report of the abduction of children in the 1960s all over the city. More than 30 kids disappeared over 10 years. Just like those kids in Atlanta, but only a few miles away. The report included an account of a black man of an incident that had happened to him as a child. Life hadn't been kind to him, and he looked like he was living on the fringes now, but he maintained that he had been lucky that night as a kid. He told how one night he had gotten late playing ball in the South Side projects, decided to take a shortcut home via a vacant lot. A car cut him off and the back door opened. He described 2 men and a driver inside, white, well-dressed. The 2 men said they were cops, but neither showed a badge. But the boy didn't trust cops. He was scared, and he took off at full speed in the opposite direction. The car tried to back up, but he finally lost them. He went to the police, the real police. But they didn't listen. Nobody cares about a black kid from the projects in this fucking city. The report ended and I wrote down the guy's name. Kyle Michael Payton. I'm actually looking for him. Maybe he knows something. And I know I'll find him. Empty rooms, 1960. Days go by slowly when something like this happens in a family. And after the storm passes, you're left with the hardest part. Living with routine. In most cases, you have to do it without anyone's help. Because nobody knows how to deal with it, and nobody wants to talk about it. Friends and acquaintances avoid tragedy like the plague, and I don't blame them. People don't know how to respond to loss, especially when it's a traumatic loss. There are 1,000 platitudes for when someone dies of old age. He lived a good life. Everyone's times comes. That kind of shit. But there are no platitudes for when something like this happens to your brother. You simply try to get used to the silent movie in your life has become. A reality plagued by uncomfortable silences, by topics that are never talked about, by routines in which that person doesn't exist, and with empty rooms. I entered the room I shared with Paul. I was still sleeping there, but I'd never taken the time to look at his things. I stared at the top bunk. I slept in the bottom bunk and never liked it. But I didn't take the top one because I had hoped Paul would come back. I looked at Paul's things, the bat sign by Sandy Koufax, the trading card collection we got in dodging Tiny Theo at McKinley Park, and his Red Sox cap. I'd not been able to remove all the mud. I washed it at least 6 times and the mud stain was still there. That fucking mud stain. I tried to wipe it off with my fingers for the umpteenth time, and I couldn't. I couldn't wipe the stain, I couldn't stop him from going in the rain, I couldn't reach him. I hadn't been fast enough, and I couldn't save him. It was hard for me to understand at the time, but I could have made any difference. It was hard for me to understand at the time that it would have made any difference that if I'd been with him, we would have both vanished in that car. I dropped the cap and burst into tears. I took a breath for a few seconds. I wiped away my tears, and I looked at my reflection in the mirror. This was my life now, and I asked myself the question, what now? What's left now? I became relentless and determined. Some of my relatives said that my reaction had been stoic, unusual for a kid my age. But I knew that this was just a sign that the system was flawed, that there were bad people out there, and this shouldn't have happened. Justice was important, but sometimes law and justice don't go hand in hand, and that's why I need to act outside the law, but just because it allows me to be faster. The journalist who wrote that article in The Observer, the CC, mentions that I have a particularly distorted view of justice, and he does not hesitate to take justice into his own hands. I wish I could answer the author that yes, my friend, that of course I have a distorted view of justice, that maybe you would have, too, if you lived through what I have. High school in 1966. The years went by. Eventually I got used to my new life. I must say they were calm years, at least compared to my childhood. Everyone saw me as a good kid, an average student and neither particularly popular nor outgoing, just another kid in high school. Even what happened in my family faded in the minds to others, not at mine, of course. I went from elementary to middle school, no problem, and then I went to John Nance Garner High School. The good thing was that it was next to Grove Hill Park. The bad thing was that I had to catch a bus to get there every day. In high school, I met new people, some good people, like Daniel Arleno, son of a Puerto Rican immigrant. He was lanky, not good at sports, and a mediocre student. But he was a smart, witty guy with a great sense of humor. We got along well from the beginning. Being working class and Catholic, it was only natural that we became friends. We would spend the afternoon playing games, arguing about all sorts of trivial things, such as who was the funniest comedian of all time, or which was the best rock band. Really, man? You really prefer the Byrds to the Beach Boys? He'd say. But for every Dan, there was 5 guys like Chet Mayer in high school. Of course, his name was Chet. Chet looked like a life-size replica of Barbie's Ken, just as dumb as he was popular. And of course, maintaining a status meant picking on people. He had it in for Dan, him and his 3 asshole friends on the football team. I don't remember their names. Bully 1, 2, and 3 will do. Look, it's fucking Speedy Gonzales. I looked at Dan. I knew him. And he was formulating a reply. One that was most likely going to mention rednecks and breeding and cousins remarrying. Nope. And cousins marrying. Dan was quick on returning insults, but not so quick on hitting back. So I knew I had to intervene. Is there a problem, Chet? This isn't about you, Donovan. It's about your Mexican friend, so get out of the way if you don't want to get it too. I guess there was no point explaining him that Dan wasn't Mexican but Puerto Rican, or that he was born in Queens and he was as American as we were. So I opted for another strategy. Okay, so I've met plenty of Chets. Mocking him won't get us any. I'm gonna say this. And so, I sucker punched Chet. I read too many superhero comics. I thought a sucker punch could knock a person down. I learned at that moment that size, weight, and strength matter a lot in a fight. Chet was on a football and a wrestling team. My sucker punch did virtually nothing, except piss him off. Jet couldn't permit the slightest sign of weakness in front of his buddies, so he threw a straight punch to my nose, and I felt it collapse. Over time, I learned that feeling means your nose has been broken. I fell to the ground groaning. I looked down at my hands, and they were soaked with blood. I noticed how the huge guy fell on me and felt the blows landing all over my ribs, my face. My poor face. I tried covering myself as best as I could while Chet was destroying me. His 3 goons didn't have to do anything. Chet was enough to beat the shit out of me. I heard the screams in the hallway. A crowd gathered, shouting, "Fight! Fight! Fight!" Calling it a fight was generous, to be honest. "Have you learned your lesson, Donny boy?" he yelled while pulling my hair. "Can you hear me?" Yeah, we're gonna say you punch like a fucking wimp. The principal came in and stopped the fight. My face was covered in blood, and I knew Chet got a couple of days of detention for it. Dan came to see me later in the infirmary. "Thanks, man, I owe you one." I shrugged. I thought it wouldn't have hurt if he had given me a hand. The day before I began my sophomore year of high school, I met Chrissy Mahan to go to the movies. She brought a tray of homemade roast beef she had cooked herself, regards to my family from her parents, and some of the joy she always carried with her. It was high noon re-release. She had been urging me to see it for days now. "Let's go for a walk, and then I'll take you to the movies. I know you're gonna love it, but popcorn and drinks on you, deal?" We left home. It was one of those sunny spring days with just the right temperature, some respite between the criminal cold of winter and the sweltering humid heat of summer. It almost seemed like one of those bucolic springtime descriptions worthy of Walt Whitman's prose. Quite a few typos. I want you guys to know it's been a little bit of a struggle. "Well, how's everything?" I shrugged my shoulders. It was a strange time in my life. I wasn't spending that much time thinking about what happened to my family, but I wasn't clear on what to focus on either. We entered the park through the main entrance. It was teeming with the usual McKinley weekend crowd. A guy from Aston Heights walking his pedigreed dog, first-time mom and dad pushing a baby stroller, a South Side band playing outdoors. Same old, same old. We continued walking through the park. We saw a couple. I'm not sure what they were. Looked like beatniks or hippies. But I don't know if there were hippies back then. The fact is that they were kissing. Some people passed by looking at them with disdain, and others looked away embarrassed. At that time, making out in public was not the most normal thing in the world. I guess that prompted Chrissy to ask me the question. "So, are you seeing anyone?" I knew from Mrs. Merlino that Chrissy was dating a boy from the neighborhood who lived at 5th and Wales. Nick or Nicholas, probably Irish, and with that name, 99% chances of being also Catholic. Apparently Mrs. Meehan was pleased with that boy. I didn't think what Officer Meehan would think. But about Chrissy's question, I didn't know how to tell her that. Oh, I can make him gay. Sure, why not? Oh, but isn't this the 60s? Would a gay man admit to being gay in the 60s? I don't know. I mean, he is a teenager, so of course if his interests were in women, he would be interested. I'm gonna say I wasn't attracted to people. I didn't say it like that, of course. I used an evasion. Some bullshit like I'm a golden bachelor, but the truth is, I've never been in love.
I do feel affection or care for people, but I'm completely insensitive to romance. Maybe things would have been different if what happened when I was a kid hadn't happened, or maybe I was born this way. Who knows? But how was I going to explain that to my best friend? I have no romantic feelings for anybody. I'm not capable of it, so no, I'm not dating anyone. Hey, pass me the popcorn. Even to this day, it's hard to explain to people. If they knew, I bet many would blame what I do on the streets on it, but that has nothing to do with it. We arrived at the Regal entrance. It was one of the largest movie theaters in the city, and as we waited for the movie to begin, Chrissy said to me, "You know what High Noon is about, don't you?" I shook my head. Chrissy explained the plot to me a bit. Gary Cooper was the sheriff in a western town. He was alone in the face of danger and had no help, and yet he was able to take on the bad guys. Sounded good. We got inside the theater, and the movie began. I was really enjoying it when something happened. It had happened to me before, but never in someone else's company. A grim thought engulfed me. Suddenly there was nothing in my mind but suffering and grief. I knew what was coming now, my inner voice torturing me for even daring to enjoy anything. It spoke. "You should be ashamed. You just want to turn over a new leaf already, huh?" I heard the voice inside me perfectly clear, even though no one uttered those words. "We already forgotten about your family. You can't allow this to happen." I felt an indescribable bitterness. The next scene changed the lighting, and I was no longer in the dark. Chrissy noticed something was wrong with me. "Hey, are you all right?" She whispered to me in the darkness of the movie theater. I nodded, and I tried to enjoy what was left of the movie, but I couldn't. The movie ended. It was really good, and it got me away from my troubles for a while, until that awkward moment. We took the subway to the downtown stop, and I walked Chrissy to her door for a shorter walk. "I wrote you something. If I give it to you, will you promise not to laugh?" she said before entering her home. She held out her hand with a piece of paper. It had her beautifully crafted handwriting, and it smelled of her perfume. "My sweet friend, always blue. If only I can get to you. Liam." She kissed me on the cheek and walked up the stairs, and while I looked at her, my good friend Christy Mihan turned around for a second to give me a smile before entering her house. The argument. The Donovan home was a shrine to a missing son. There were no family photos anymore, just Paul all over the place. Mom talked to the press and gave interviews nonstop, but interest faded over time. For them, Paul was just another missing child. She left her job at the Agnelos, and she only went out to go to church daily. She was finally complying with her obligations to the Lord, from church to home and from home to church. That was her routine, more and more sullen. Meanwhile, my parents' marriage was going down the drain. I wouldn't say that they had an easy marriage, but at least they were happy together. With Paul gone, all that had vanished. It seemed like Mom couldn't stand Dad, nor his constant attempts to cheer her up. With me, she was cold and distant, as if I didn't even exist. But it wasn't only us. She's been flagellating herself so much that she had to find other people to blame. First, Mrs. Malorino for not picking us up on time. Then it was Joe Agnolino's turn for scheduling her for the late afternoon shift that day. It was like she needed it. Dinner was always particularly awkward. What used to be a family time became time in front of the TV. Another disappearance, another child. In this case, near Burnley, by the bridge, Dad rushed to change the channel, but my mother stopped him. "No, I want to hear what they say. Perhaps there's some information that could help us find Paul." But this was too much for Dad. "Esther, listen, you know what I suspected he was going to say. Mom, too. Don't, Frank. I won't you say that in our house. My son is alive, and I know her." Can't say this one. This is what they mean that says you can't pick the ones you... I let Dad speak. "Esther, listen, it's been 8 years. We have to accept that our son isn't..." My father stopped dead in his tracks when he heard the glass my mother had thrown against the wall burst. She was leaning against the table, her eyes wide open. Neither my father nor I understood what this outburst of rage was all about. "Didn't you hear me, Frank? I told you not to say that in this house. Do you hear me?" And then she took a cloth and picked up the broken glass, just like that. My father took a breath and sat down to finish eating. I didn't want to eat anymore. I cleared my plate, left it in the sink, and went to my room. After a while, my father came in. He sat down next to me and hugged me. Your mother's not well, son. You have to give her some time, and she'll be herself again, you'll see. I understood that I could never fully grasp the pain Mom was in, and I didn't want her to give up hope if it would help her move on, but I did want her to try making life together at least bearable. Unfortunately, life together only got worse. High school hero. A couple more years passed. In a blink of an eye, I reached my senior year. Sometimes genetics can be capricious. Chet Mayer was the tallest guy in the class a few years ago, but in the last few years, I had a growth spurt. We were in the same height now. I took advantage of my physique to do wrestling for a year. I wasn't bad at it. The best thing was seeing how the bullies stopped busting my balls now that I could stand up to them. And Dan was under my protection, so they stopped picking on him too. In the end, however, I quit wrestling and joined the football team. I never had any interest in sports besides trading cards. I wasn't too good at passing, nor did I have any good eye for the game, but I was reasonably fast. And I knew that if I excelled in football, I might have a chance to qualify for a college scholarship. I played starting wide receiver for Nance Garner Tigers. Tiger. The name had always sounded dumb to me. All high school football team names were somewhere between Eagle, Tiger, and Wildcat. Chet Mayer was the quarterback and the star of the team. He and I had virtually no relationship beyond the sport. We both avoided giving Coach Stockton any trouble. Even though he knew that Chet and I hated each other, he managed to make sure that when we were in the field, we had a rapport. And we usually did. The first few games of the season had been tough, but although we struggled, we made it all the way to the playoff semifinals. Considering the short history of Nance Garner Tigers, it was quite an accomplishment. The tension was palpable as we took to the field to play for a spot on the finals, the penultimate game of the season. It was against St. Louis High School and their Hurricanes, Chrissy's high school. How life plays tricks on you sometimes. I saw her entering the stadium dressed in her cheerleading uniform. I don't know the name of the position she held in the formation. I knew she wasn't the front spotter or the one doing cartwheels. That's called a flyer, I think. Anyway, we didn't pay much attention to each other. We both had our minds in other things, and we were on different teams. The referee blew the whistle and the match began. It started badly. During the first quarter, we didn't even have a single minute of possession. We were defending the whole time. The Hurricanes quarterback, a guy named Casey, wearing number 17, seemed unstoppable. When we finally got possession, they advanced so far and were so close to our end zone that we were forced to give it away by kicking the ball to the other end of the field. The Hurricanes scored an extra point touchdown courtesy of number 17. Fucking Casey again. During the first intermission, Coach Stockton almost lost his voice from chewing us out for playing with such empathy. We had to respond, and boy, did we. We scored a touchdown a few minutes into the second quarter, 4 straight perfect drives, without losing a single down, with a couple of long receptions of my own. Tiger 6, Hurricane 7, it smelled of a comeback. But the whole team's morale plummeted when we were robbed on the conversion attempt, and the Hurricanes advanced half a field. I think that was the only play of the game that Casey wasn't involved in. The Hurricanes managed to score again, but missed the extra point. During the next few plays, we lost possession. We defended well, but they got one last down close to the goalpost. They managed to get the number 3 points in with a nice... Okay. Typos. They managed to get the 3 points in with a nice kick. Number 17. Fuck. He was good at kicking, too. The cheers for Casey lit up the stadium. It seemed like the Hurricanes were the home team. However, before the end of the third quarter, we managed to score a spectacular touchdown, a single play by Chet. We also missed the conversion, though. But at last this time, they didn't steal the ball from us. Tigers 12, Hurricanes 16. The last quarter was a war of attrition. I think that's a typo. But, confession, I know nothing. I know jack shit about football. So any typos or the way that the sentence is structured, I wouldn't have no idea if that's the way it's supposed to. Anyway, exhaustion took its toll on both teams, and we both made a lot of mistakes. But little by little, we managed to advance until we were very close to the Hurricanes' end zone. There were only a few minutes left in the game. Possession was ours, and we were 12 to 16 on the last touchdown. The possession was ours. We were 12 to 16 on the last down, just 3 yards away from a touchdown. The referee looked at the clock and yelled 10 seconds left, and the play would decide the whole game. And if we scored, we would win, and the Tigers would advance to the final. If we missed, the Hurricanes went through. Chet raised his arm and called the play with his hand. I don't know what the fuck he was thinking. 3 yards to a touchdown, and he signaled a long pass run play. The ref blew the whistle. I decided to trust him. I ran as fast as I could until I got to the end line. Above all, I was a team player. If Chet wanted to take a chance, I had to trust him, even if he was an absolute asshole. I started sprinting past the defensive line. My defender wasn't expecting such a deep placement. He stayed further forward, and I managed to get rid of him. I threw my head back. I watched as Chet threw the ball a few moments before he was knocked down. The pass was intended for me, although it was a little wide. The ball went over the Hurricanes defenders, who were looking up to see the ball's trajectory. I had to catch the ball before it hit the ground. I ran as fast as I could. It was really close. I jumped at the last moment and felt the leather off of the ball settle in my hands. I fell to the ground with the ball firmly in my grasp, and there was a second of silence. And the field erupted in a roar of cheers. The referee's whistle signaling the end of the game was not even heard. I looked at Chet. He was screaming with his arms in the air in celebration as the stadium chanted his name. Half the team fell on him, and then the other half of the team fell on me. When I finally managed to get out from the mountain of players on top of me, I looked around and spotted my family in our bleachers, applauding. It had been a while since I'd seen them so close to being happy. I knew that in a few days everything would be back to normal, but I decided to seize the moment and greet them. After a while, I saw this Casey approaching. He made all the right moves to almost win the match by himself, and he had almost succeeded. The guy looked pissed off, but he still shook my hand and said to me, "That last play was spectacular, man. Good luck in the final." Once the euphoria of the celebration was over, I went straight to the locker room. On the way to the shower, I passed Chet, who was finishing dressing. I praised him. That pass wasn't bad for a punk like you, I mean. I patted him on the shoulder, and he smiled. And that was a pretty decent reception for a dork like you, he replied. Well played, Donovan. We stood looking at each other, smiling. Chet closed the locker and left. Though if this was a gay romance, if I made him gay, he'd be totally after him. That was the first conversation I had with Chet Meyer that didn't come to blows, and it would not be the last, but that's another story. Halloween costume party in 1969. A friend of Chrissy's invited her to a Halloween party at his house in Aston Heights and told her to bring her friends. Chrissy told me, but also her boyfriend, Nick. I also liked Halloween, and even though it had lost its charm when I grew up, I was looking forward to dressing up. I spent some time thinking about what costume I chose, but it didn't take me too long to decide. I always wanted to dress as a Lone Ranger. I loved it when I was a kid. I remember the four of us in front of the TV watching Clayton Moore next to another guy whose name I can't remember, and who certainly wasn't Native American playing Tonto. A fiery horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty hi-ho silver, the Lone Ranger. I used to scream those lines at the top of my lungs while riding with a broom between my legs through the house, humming the William Tell overture. So I said to myself, what the hell? I'm going to go dressed as the Lone Ranger. At the store, they made me a pretty decent costume, a domino mask, a fancy white hat, and all that shit. But the weather was freezing cold, and I had to take the subway, so I took my long coat. On the subway, there were more people in costume, lots of kids getting ready to go trick-or-treating, couples with matching costumes, usual Halloween stuff. A guy in a Frankenstein costume opened the door to an apartment 3 times the size of my own house. They had all the Halloween essentials there, plastic bats, carved pumpkins, and an eggnog conveniently spiked with booze. Then I saw Chrissy coming towards me from the end of the living room. Hey, you came! And she hugged me. She had dressed up as Wilma Flintstone, and she looked very pretty, even with the updo, which made her look older. Next to her was a guy dressed as Fred Flintstone, so this had to be the Nick guy. Hey, this is Nick Casey. Nick, this is Donovan. Casey. Damn, I recognized him immediately. He was the quarterback from the St. Louis Hurricanes, number 17. The guy was a big, strapping Irish lad, light brown hair, and square jaw. The guy came over and shook my hand. Not a bone crusher, not a dead fish, and he looked like a really good sort, too. Hey, finally, nice to meet you. He stared at me for a second. Wait, aren't you the Tigers wide receiver? He must have been a good face reader to recognize me without my helmet. We chatted for a while, and I was pleasantly surprised. In fact, I liked him quite a lot. As he talked about his family, about his life, I noticed a certain familiarity. I would say that he was very similar to me, but without being broken inside. I never felt envy before, and the first time I felt it was for Nick Casey. It had nothing to do with Chrissy, or maybe it did, because Nick seemed to have a similar life to mine. He was a working-class kid, he was a nice fella, and he was going to have a decent future, probably with Chrissy. A normal life, something I would never aspire to. I was happy for her, but I couldn't help but feel like shit. As if fate had played a trick on me, marking my existence for life. That event had turned me into a freak. I looked at the people in the party. They're having a good time. They're happy. What's wrong with me, I thought. So I put my hat away and began to drink more than usual. Alcohol was always a good anesthetic for the soul, but I was not used to it. By the fourth glass of eggnog, suddenly my life, my shitty existence, the death of my family, it all seemed to fade, like a bad dream. I just thought, fuck it all, right? And I kept drinking, like crazy. At one point, Chrissy approached me. She looked concerned. She asked me if I was okay. I shrugged and smiled like an idiot. I was drunk as fuck. And I guess she took that as a yes, and I kept drinking. Until I threw up in the middle of the living room, on a rug I might add. Looked really expensive. I heard the commotion. Who brought this asshole to a party? The owner of the house was saying. I tried to apologize, but it was hard for me to articulate the words. I left the party with my forehead covered in sweat and an awful taste in my mouth. I felt like shit, and not only physically. I'd behaved like a moron, and I was ashamed to go back to the party. I decided to take a walk. After a couple of minutes, I realized I didn't know where the fuck I left my hat. I was so drunk. I left it in that house. The night air cleared my head, and I felt a little better. I walked several blocks, covered myself as best as I could against the miserable cold. November is not a good month to be walking around the city, much less if you're dressed like a fucking idiot. And although my long coat covered me, I couldn't stop shivering. The cold was clearing my head, but the more I sobered up, the colder I got. And I realized that I was in the area of the south side I didn't know. I tried picking up the pace. I just wanted to walk 10 more blocks and I'd get home. After that, I'd just lie in bed and call it a day. Everyone knew that the south side was the city's red light district. Back then, it wasn't like it was now. Brothels looked like elegant joints, and girls weren't walking the streets, shivering from the cold in fishnet stockings and a leopard coat. But even when covered by a layer of glamour, abuse and harassment was always there. As I walked past one of these clubs, I heard a muffled groan in the alley to my right, and then a loud clatter. A guy had pushed a girl against the garbage cans. She couldn't have been much older than me, and this guy was beating her to death. Calm down, Ricky, please. I can explain, please. Lights went on in the neighborhood, and there were voices screaming, What the fuck is going on in there? It's almost midnight. Leave that girl alone, asshole. I asked you a question, bitch. Where's my fucking money? I want my money now. And the guy yelled like as he pulled out a knife. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. I stood still too, watching the scene. The girl stared at me. He looked like Ricky Ricardo, Lucille Ball's husband. I wondered if that's where his nickname came from. You got a problem, buddy? Said the guy as he pointed his knife at me. In fact, I do. I don't like guys who hit women. Under any other circumstances, I wouldn't have done anything. But it was late. I was angry from the show that I'd given at the party, and I was still drunk enough not to think about the consequences, but not so drunk that I couldn't handle myself. Fuck it. My tongue was getting tangled, have a fucking problem with guys who hit women. Ricky focused his attention on me. Not only his attention, his knife too. The girl took the opportunity to escape, but not before calling out, Don't hurt him! Do you hear me? Don't you dare do anything to him! At first I thought she was warning Ricky, but then I understood it was me she was warning. The poor thing had a crush on the piece of shit. You're welcome, damn it, I thought. What a world we're living in. Fuck. You're not going to give me all the cash you have on you, but I'm going to charge extra for all the trouble you've caused. No, Ricky, you're going to give me all your money right now. I pulled out the toy gun. You think I'm going to buy that handsome, he said. However, I noticed a certain hesitation in his voice. Although he pretended to look like one, Ricky was not a dangerous criminal. He was a hyena in a jungle of lions, a scavenger, but not a predator. Surely Ricky was a con man piece of shit, a typical pimp, and I was just a drunk kid, but I could feel Ricky was a fucking wuss. You could see it a mile away, and that's why I dared to do what I did. I cocked the toy gun. The guy looked at me without saying anything, and that poorly lit alley and at that distance looked like a real gun. Son of a bitch. Ricky reached into his wallet and threw a few dollars to my feet, and then he backed away. And I smiled as he turned and ran down the alley. Fuck you, Ricky. And then I heard the applause and cheers. I looked up. Leaning out of the windows of the alley were several neighbors enjoying the show. I guess Ricky's fit of rage were a common occurrence in the area, and he was not well liked. I didn't quite know how to react, and besides, I was still a little drunk. So I put my coat on and walked out of the alley. The wind hit me in the face. I was freezing cold. On the way home, I inhaled a deep breath of the frigid city air, and it felt really good. I went home trying not to wake anyone, and it was very late. I snuck into my room, and suddenly I saw myself reflected in the mirror. I'd forgotten how strange I looked. I was wearing a domino mask, a long coat, and a wild rag. But I didn't look like a moron dressed as a cowboy. I looked like one of those superheroes from Dad's comics, like the Spirit or the Shadow or that Green Hornet from TV. Hilarious. And I smiled into the bedroom mirror. I lay down on the bed, and with that smile, I fell asleep peacefully. The city was one less unjust today. Alright, I think I'm going to stop here. It's been going on 2 hours, if you can't tell my voice is going. I like it. I like visual novels like this in games. I like the mystery of it, but it definitely is just a lot of reading, and I like, I want to know where it's going. But anyway, I'm stopping here. It's been a great demo. I like it. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for keeping me company, and I will be back soon with something else.